international architectural contest and for the design of the museum, and we invited curator Evandro Salles for the conceptual part, and that's going to be the first maritime museum in Brazil. The purpose of this seminar is to present this design and this project at the national level and at the international museum community in order to start a dialogue with the other institutions and the public. We understand that debate and collaboration with maritime museums that are internationally outstanding as our distinguished guests this process is going to contribute to the development of the future museum. Today's theme is curatorships and audiences. We have Ms. Gail Simonton, Director of Collections and Public Engagement for the Royal Museum of Greenwich, London, United Kingdom. Mr. Torbjorn Turp, who's a curator of the Maritime Museum in Denmark, in Elsinore. Mr. Pierangelo Campodonico, Director of the MUMA, which includes the Galatan de Museo de Mare in Genoa, Italy. And mediation is going to be held by the curator of the Maritime Museum of Brazil, Mr. Evandro Salles, whom takes the floor right now. Thank you, Adriana. Good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure to be here on the second day of our seminar with our distinguished guests, whom I'd like to welcome. It is a pleasure to welcome you in this space so we can start this exchange, which I consider to be absolutely significant at this moment when we are launching ourselves in this adventure of building a new museum, which is going to be the first public maritime museum in Brazil. Therefore, I'd like to invite to pass the floor to Ms. Gail Simonton, who's Director of Collections and Public Engagement of the Royal Museum in Greenwich, London, United Kingdom. Ms. Simonton has been dedicated to the museums sector and general heritage for more than 25 years. She's currently responsible for various teams, which includes exhibitions, design, learning and interpretation, learning sciences and public engagement, use of collections, curatorship, and development of content. In the 5 spaces of the Greenwich's Royal Museum, her interests and passions are in the connections between public and collections, in the incredible things that may happen when they meet. Ms. Simonton will make her speech about a theme which is very dear to us, which is the museum's strategic view, art, history, and science. Ms. Simonton, you have the floor.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me 1 second. Hopefully you can all see that. Is that okay? Great, I'm going to launch in. So thank you very much. My name is Gail Simonton. I'm Director of Collections and Public Engagement at Royal Museums Greenwich. And today I've been asked to talk to you about a strategic view of museums regarding art, science and history. So what am I going to discuss today? Well, I thought I could introduce you to our sites here in Greenwich in London and talk a little bit about our relationship to art, science and history, and then to share the process that we've been through over the last couple of years to reassess our strategic approach to museums and really to share what we've learned along the way in the hope that it will be relevant to your organisation. So over the last couple of years, we looked very hard at who we are, why we're here and what we want to do. In other words, our strategy. By sharing this journey, I hope to explore with you what we mean by a strategic view, what is a museum or content strategy, and how can art, science and history relate to the maritime experience. When I was asked to speak on art, science and history today, I thought it was very interesting as these were the first 3 words that we started with. So, what do these words mean? What does Royal Museums Greenwich mean? Well, to different people, it means different things. Royal to many people can mean status. Museums can mean a very welcoming public place to some and a place that doesn't reflect anything to do with your life to others. Greenwich, of course, is the location, but we have the same issue with national, important, representative of the nation, maritime. Is it about the sea? Is it about giant container ships? Or is it about stripy tops on a catwalk? It can mean very different things to different people. And museum, there's that word again. So I think what we realized is that those words can mean very different things to different people. And so what connects these three words of art, history, and science? Well, how are they different at each of our sites? And does the name or names even matter? Does this categorization even matter? I was thinking this could apply to sites, collections, galleries, and areas of research. So the fact that maritime museums are unique in their ability to cover all three of these areas, I think is really important for this conference and this seminar. But how do you do that without alienating people? What about those people that think differently to you? And how do you do it without getting bogged down in one of those areas and not others? There's been so much to choose from that I do think that maritime museums have never been more relevant. So let me take you around our sites. First of all, this is the Queen's House, which is a beautiful royal villa designed by Inigo Jones. It's Britain's first classical building, and it's a pioneering masterpiece of 17th century. Royal Museums Greenwich is made up of 4 or 5 different sites, depending on how you look at it, and this is one of them. But what is the Queen's House? Is it art? This is a picture of the tulip staircase that you find inside the building. Is this a beautiful piece of art or sculpture? Is this a triumph of technology? It's the first cantilevered spiral staircase in Britain. So is it about science? Or is it a piece of history, this idea of it being a first? Here we have the Royal Observatory, the home of space and time. I'm able to speak to you from the home of the Greenwich Meridian Line and GMT, so I can say good morning to some of you and good afternoon to others. It's the home of awe-inspiring astronomy. It's a working observatory where we take spectacular photos of the universe. And it was established in the 17th century by Charles II, and today it's a unique visitor attraction. But looking at one of the key objects of the observatory is a key navigational piece, which is one of John Harrison's clocks, one of his set that we have here at the museum. Once again, is this a thing of beauty, a piece of art in its own right? Is this a breakthrough of technology and engineering, and therefore science? Or is it a historic moment captured in one object, the longitude problem, a piece of history? And here we have the National Maritime Museum. It encompasses so many different themes and ideas, it's hard to encapsulate in one. It's one of the largest of its kind in terms of collections in the world, and it covers multiple subjects, themes, and collections. And one of our star pieces of our collection is, of course, the Cutty Sark, one of the fastest tea clippers of her day, who transported wool for the trade later, but tea was the originator of the cargo. And thinking about the Cutty Sark and the National Maritime Museum together, are they about history? Looking at this piece, which is a Yinka Shonobari, an artist that we worked with in the past, which stands outside the National Maritime Museum, is this an artistic response? Is this an exploration of craftsmanship in terms of the ship in the bottle and therefore science? Or is this a comment on history, a comment of Admiral Nelson's flagship, HMS Victory, is constructed using African fabrics, drawing attention to colonialism, empire, and trade. So once again, it's not completely clean cut. So in our exploration, we thought, well, let's boil it down even further from there. If we think about the Queen's House focus, art, then we think about the National Maritime Museum and the Cutty Sark focus, all of a sudden history becomes sea. And if we think about the Royal Observatory focus, all of a sudden science becomes sky, and those words become words that people can relate to in a way that they perhaps couldn't before. Then we got a bit stuck. We started to think, well, what is a strategic view? Where does this take us? Well, we forced ourselves to step back and look at the whole operation. Let's have a think about everything. And if you stop and you Google the word strategy, what you get back is high-level plan to achieve objectives in uncertain conditions. Well, I don't think our conditions could be more uncertain than they are at the moment. It goes on to say how the ends, in other words, the goals, the outputs, the products, will be achieved by the means In other words, the resources, the staff, the collections, the external expertise. We started to ask ourselves these really big questions, and asking those questions during a pandemic was of a particular focus. Who are we? Why are we here? What is it that we're doing? Who's it all for? How do we do it? And what that might look like. We really had to start with those questions before we got anywhere. We had a great debate about, should we be a collections first organisation? Should we be an audience first organisation? If you ask many of the curators, they would say collections first. If you ask anyone in the learning team or the front of house team, they should say we should be audience first. And of course, the answer that we found was neither. It's where they meet that the magic happens. So tackling that question of who are we, why are we here? I wanted to use an example of our Sea Things gallery, which is really about connection to the sea. It explores this relationship in a non-narrative gallery at a time when many people in the UK, who are never very far from the sea, as I think someone mentioned in the conference yesterday, but people don't feel connected to the sea in a way that they might have done in the past. So we asked this question: what is your relationship with the sea or with the ocean? People found relevance in many of these objects on display. As it was a non-narrative gallery, they could directly relate to individual objects on a very personal basis. So they looked at things like migration and perhaps their journey and how they became in the UK or visiting the museum. We had other comments around childhood memories, a day at the seaside, a fondness of the ocean, a romantic view of the ocean. And then, of course, there's people whose work and livelihood depends on the sea in terms of the River Thames itself, which flows through London, or the wider sea and oceans of the world. This idea of the ocean kept coming back to us. Everyone, it seems, has some connection with this idea of ocean. So we decided to bring the ocean into the museum, and not just when the roof leaks. So we wanted to remind people of their relationship with the sea. So in our Pacific Encounters gallery at the National Maritime Museum, we look at a giant wave which meets you and feels like you could almost surf it as you enter the gallery. And the gallery feels like it's been flooded up to your knees. So you feel very much part of that water, that sea, that ocean. And in this gallery here, Sea Things, the digital displays are evoking a seashore. So those objects have been washed up on the seashore and delivering you ideas and connections and information about the sea. Everyone was keen to talk about themes. And I'm sure it's the same in other museums. It's traditionally what drives museum and content outputs. So we made a list: trade, empire, leisure, conflict, environment. Does it sound familiar? It's probably familiar because it could relate to any maritime museum across the world, or possibly any other museum across the world. They just felt like a list of words that could be used anywhere. So we felt actually we needed to start with values. We wanted to be a values-led institution. And the pandemic taught us that if we are to connect with people, to be relevant and think about how and why we do things, and not always starting with the what, then we might get somewhere. Too many exhibitions have gone unvisited, and too many galleries have remained empty, and we wanted to change that. You probably can't see this in any great detail, but what you're looking at here is a strategic overview of our content strategy, which is called Charting Our Course. We've been working on this since around 2019, and we've really been trying to develop this strategy to provide direction and focus for what we do. This slide represents our strategic overview, charting our course at the museum. Instead of a sort of 30-page document that might sort of sit on the shelf once everyone's half read it and cast it to the side, we wanted to have everything on one piece of paper. This idea that it can be printed out and is on our website, it can be printed out and available on our sites, and it's in our back of house areas. We didn't want that straitjacket of a strategy. We wanted an inspiring direction of travel, which encouraged people to get on board rather than a document that basically told them what to do. 2020 saw our lives change in ways that were unimaginable before. So much around us is shifting, and it's time for us to think about how we serve and work with our communities and where our priorities lie. We wanted to reshape how we work with each other, stakeholders, and prioritise what is relevant and meaningful to them. using our collections and expertise to their full potential. So this diagram here, it breaks it broadly into 4 sections, which I'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute, but it's basically why we're here, our social purpose, what we do in social function, who we are, our sites, the guiding concepts, I guess, like our themes, and our relevance, so how we'll know if we're successful. So here we have this idea of being values-led. So we came to the conclusion that museums are places that hold collections, gathering together objects, historical information and memories. RMG's collections are held in trust for the nation of the UK. Through our collections, we connect the past to the people in the present day, and they can also help us to think about and shape the future. RMG has social purpose at its heart to serve our communities and stakeholders in line with our function as museums. We strive to foster inclusion and equality, to be a place of and for opportunity, to support well-being and to encourage active citizens. We want everyone to feel welcome and see themselves at Royal Museums Greenwich. Our primary aim will be to be relevant and meaningful, both reaching out and inviting in, welcoming all and supporting their well-being, especially after and during the pandemic. We share our expertise in ways shaped by our audiences through multiple platforms and listen to and promote the expertise and lived experience of others. We know that museums are not unbiased. It's impossible. We're not impartial and we're not neutral. And we have, excuse me, in the past been dominated by singular narratives. But now we want to strive to tell histories more fully, recognising different perspectives and working with stakeholders to be honest about the past, giving an equality of voice and recognising intersecting identities. So, why? Why are we here? Our function in society, the values-led bit. We can help people to understand why the world is as it is, creating this shared sense of place, of belonging and of community, while also recognising and representing diversity and individuality. And here comes that's the people bit, if you like. And then the collection bit is we care for a unique array of objects and buildings with our collections, but they must be at the heart of what we do. What? So this is taking a look at our guiding concepts rather than themes. So these are interpreted through our collections and shared expertise. These are the filter or the lens with which our potential activities, so exhibitions, programs, publications, are viewed. And they'll help us to move from big ideas to specific stories and content and provide coherence, efficiency, inspiration, and connectivity. So our 3 sets of guiding concepts are adversity, adaptability, and habitability as a group. And we often talk about climate change, rising seas, and the habitability of the planet within those areas. We then have creativity, practicality, and ingenuity. A lot of the Royal Observatory's work falls into this area in terms of scientific discoveries and breaking down those boundaries. And identity, equality, and community travels across everything that we do. The next quadrant of the strategy looks at who we are as Royal Museums Greenwich. We are explorers of time, space, place, and belonging. Our collections and subjects are about investigating worlds, crossing boundaries, bridging cultures, and creating connections. We are a place to explore the very essence of what makes us human. Our collections reach across continents, cultural divides, tumultuous seas, and cosmic voids. Through our institution, we have a uniquely interdisciplinary potential: art, history, science, which we can tackle separately or in dialogue with each other. Our subjects are local, global, and universal. They help us to pose big questions about the universe that we live in, the planet we live on, and its people. So our next thought was, well, what can we deliver? Well, the Queen's House could deliver beautiful things in beautiful places. The National Maritime Museum and the Cutty Sark could deliver our ocean and our planet. And the ROG, the Royal Observatory, could concentrate on awe and wonder and universal appeal. And when you combine that with our digital platforms and of course our collection, that together gives us who am I? Where do I come from? Ultimately, an exploration of what it means to be human. The next step along the how question, in terms of mapping it out, we must have clear timelines and a strategic plan. This will involve mapping the journey in the following ways. So in vision, 1 to 5 years, that clear sense of output and understanding of what you're doing in the near future. On the horizon, the 5 to 10 years, looking at what possibilities are out there and what we should be looking out for. And then, of course, there's the imagination, that blue sky thinking and experimentation that looks beyond and further and where we're going. This will enable us to enhance our reach and our reputation, and of course, the all-important fundraiser. The next along this, the question of how is storytelling. We've thought a lot about, well, if you're reading, excuse me one moment. Sorry about that. If you're reading a child a bedtime story, you adapt to suit their age, their understanding, their experience of life so far. Well, why not the same with everybody else? Museums are houses of memory, and memories are shared through stories. The museum can tell stories by drawing on the collection, people's experiences and internal expertise. The collection, of course, comprises of objects, seemingly without explicit narratives, but existing as material culture of the past. It has representations such as photographs, prints, drawings, and paintings, with meanings framed and implied by the maker, but interpreted by the user. And of course, written materials, which can be divided into records, so data, notes of activity or priority, narratives, books, diaries, and communications, orders, letters, audios, emails. So let's call all of these objects. We are aiming to open up our collection through meaning making, sharing thoughts, knowledge and ideas, promoting better connections through revealing relevance, creating interpretations, and exploring new perspectives that present a coherent, grounded, playful approach to engaging people. So what can objects do for a story, and what can a story do for an object? It can enable opportunities for useful connections to be made between objects and people and objects. We can provide a framework for thematic links through history. We can give prompts for reigniting those memories. We can provide historical and social context, so creating value and meaning for an object, open it up by including perspectives, reactions and reflections. We can provide information through a more memorable and impactful experience, engaging hearts, hands, and minds. And we can feel familiar. Stories can feel familiar, but we can help people to step into others' shoes, to have some empathy for others, to provide people with intriguing details, but leave enough space for the imagination, as any good story does. We can allow ambiguity, because we simply do not know everything about our collections or our sites. The story is, of course, at the heart of it all. This process is both simple and complex. Simple because it is innate to humans, but complex in a museum context. The museum can use its collaborators and communities to co-create, curate, develop and test stories in what we research and how we research it, how we structure it, what we connect to, objects, people, ideas, visitors, and what format the story will be delivered in. We not only curate the collection, but we curate the dynamic relationship between the collection and the public through stories delivered in different formats: publications, exhibitions, lectures, discussions, physical or virtual. This slide has the metaphor of a waterfall, and that's how these stories are told in an agile, an iterative, a flexible and responsive way. Responding to the journey is the destination. We want to produce measurable outputs along the way and not just concentrate on the end product. Ideas can be refined and enhanced by an iterative process and multiple interactions with audiences along the way. However, ideas need not always cascade or progress in the same manner. So I've given you two different options here. For example, a temporary exhibition may be a very useful testbed for a permanent gallery, but not always. Temporary exhibitions can also be a counterpoint to permanent displays, allowing the museum to borrow, tell stories which cannot be supported by RMG collections alone, and allow us to move quickly to respond to opportunities. They're also a great vehicle for fun. But hopefully you can see from this that a digital piece, a podcast series, for example, could be the end of this cascade, or it could be the beginning. So what does success look like? We thought long and hard about this too, and I just wanted to finish with a few of the ideas that we came up with. So how will we know if we're succeeding in this strategy? Well, people will feel welcome in the museum and want to share their experiences. People are consulted in the development of new programs, galleries and exhibitions to ensure that we're useful, meaningful and relevant. The museum will be embedded in its community and part of people's everyday lives, fulfilling our local, national and international potential. Stakeholders represent a greater diversity of people and feel connected. Then, of course, funders will want to share in our success. Our reach and our reputation will speak for themselves. And we want to be leaders in the understanding of Britain's history, legacies and future, and how that fits in a global perspective. Our collection will be used to the fullest of its potential to explore a wide range of historical subjects and contemporary issues, often connecting the two. And I suppose ultimately, everybody knows what we do, who we are, and why it's important. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your wonderful lecture, Ms. Symington. We now begin a process of constructing a museum. Listening to such a fundamental subject matter to building our project is something absolutely important. And then at the end, we would like to discuss a little further about the comments that you have made. I now would like to give the floor to our second speaker, who is Mr. Torbjorn Turp, who is Masters in History and Geography and a curator of Denmark's Maritime Museum at the north of Copenhagen. His main attributions or functions are ability, exhibits, and the management of collections. He has been involved in exhibits about topics such as fashion, sexuality, diesel engines, and expeditions to the Arctic. The next projects include the renovation of the vessel model exhibits, a exhibit of bags and their cultural meaning. The museum in Denmark has an architectonic project by Bigger Architecture. Mr. Turp, we will address the reinvention of architecture of museums, which is, as we speak, absolutely of the essence, because we are precisely in a process of constructing or building our own maritime museum and just about to choose the architectonic processes that we will draft upon. Mr. Turp, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm honored to be here. Now I'll just have to start my show. Here you go. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. It's an honor for me to participate and be able to be almost in Brazil without being anywhere else than in my own home. The background you see is not my own home. That's the one of the exhibitions we have now at our museum, the Maritime Museum of Denmark. I'll just present myself. I'm a curator. I've had one job my whole life as a professional, and that's that's been at the Maritime Museum of Denmark. But the museum has changed profoundly during my stay at the museum and while I've been working at it. So it's while we share a lot of themes, a lot of storytelling, a lot of narrative with the old museum, we're also in many ways a brand new museum, or rather new museum. I studied history and geography, so one of my main interests is the connection between people and places. Where people grow up, they have a strong connection to where they grow up, where their parents are from, where their children grow up, and all the places connecting them to other people. And our museum, we strive to be a place where people they meet as well. And also, I'm a member of the board elected by my colleagues. So our museum, it has a board, and one of the board members is not necessarily a curator, but also always a staff member, and that's for the time being me. So I get to see the work behind the scenes at the museum as well from a board perspective. So the picture you see here is where we are. Don't know if my cursor works, but you can see there's a castle in the middle. That's a Kronborg castle. That's our old home. So when I started working in the museum, like 14 years ago, we were at the museum, and we were at the castle, and our museum opened the first time, the 1st of August 1915 at the castle. And then we moved away from home, so to speak, after almost 100 years at the beautiful castle, into another beautiful building, a new beautiful building, the MS Maritime Museum of Denmark, which you can see in the old dry dock next to the ramparts. This area between the town, which is all the town of Helsingør, or Elsinore, as you know it in English, you can see the town right on the edge, the left edge of the screen. This area between the castle and the town used to be a shipyard. Or even further back, it just used to be a part of town. Then that part of town was torn down to make room for fortifications. And again, and centuries later, these fortifications, they were torn down themselves to make room for the shipyard, because the age of industry was dawning in Helsingør. But then in the 1980s, almost all shipyards in Denmark, they closed, including the one in Elsinore. And then for a couple of decades, that there was this, I wouldn't say empty space because people were using it, but it was almost like a scar in the middle of the town, because a lot of the mentality in the town, and especially also a lot of the economy in the town, was tied to the shipyard. And then for a couple of decades, the politicians, the trusts, they were debating how to develop this vacant area into something that would be interesting for the local community as well as visitors from abroad, because Helsingør, because of the Kronborg Castle, has always had a lot of visitors from abroad. So you have to see our museum in connection to the castle, the library, the concert halls, and the tourism which is already in place in Helsingør, which I guess, and I've never been to Rio myself, but I imagine there's quite a lot of tourists as well, probably much more than in Helsingør, but we also, by Danish standards, there are quite a lot of tourists in our town. So I'm gonna progress a bit. This is our old home. As you see, it's a European Renaissance castle built 400 years ago. And it's challenging, as some of you might know, it's challenging working with museums and collections and storytelling in a modern way in old buildings. But that's often how it is, because old buildings, they can be difficult to find a use for them. And then more or less voluntarily, museums, they move in. And this is a photo of Elsinore, the port of Elsinore, a bit more than 100 years ago. This is not there wouldn't normally be that many sailing vessels in the port, but this was an icy winter, and now we hardly have icy winters anymore in Denmark, but back in the day they did. And of course, the sailing vessels, they couldn't sail in the ice, so they had to seek port and wait for the ice to lift again. So this is taken from the Elsinore Cathedral, and if you took this photo now, you'll see our museum almost in the bang middle of the picture. This is a photo taken from the other direction, from the castle towards the town, and you see that this area that we occupy was heavily industrialized, and it was visually and mentally, economically, the center of the town. So a lot of, especially elderly people in our local community, they miss the old shipyard. To them, that was their youth, that was their working place, that was their community, and it left an empty space, almost a void in them, that the industry disappeared. So we also, apart from being a national maritime museum, we also have to cater to be a space for the local community, of course. This, it might be difficult to see, but this is actually our museum. This is how it looked when I started working there as a young student warden in the around 15 years ago. So this is the old dry dock, and ironically, as you probably know, dry docks, they're wet most of the time, and that was the case for our dock as well. It was basically a lake surrounded by concrete walls, and it had been like that for around 20 years. And then construction work started. Initially, there were plans to move our museum to Copenhagen, but we couldn't raise funds for that because, of course, we had to find a lot of external funding. And the trust, they were saying, hey, you know, there's already a lot of museums in Copenhagen. We would like to keep this important maritime history in Elsinore. And so we did. And this is our dry dock, our current museum, in the process of being changed from an industrial site or industrial relic to a modern maritime museum. It was, as it already been said, it was Bjarke Engel's group BIG who won the competition back in 2017. And they did that because they were literally thinking outside the box. Originally, the plan was to build the museum inside the dry dock with some kind of lighting from above. But they figured that they wanted to preserve the old concrete walls, to preserve the industrial heritage. And of course, you can't just have a museum in a dry dock without insulating the walls, because the walls, they are moist all the time. There's moisture seeping through them because they're not built to be a basement. They're not built to be a museum. They were built to be a dry dock, which is always moist. So we had to insulate the whole dock. Then Bjarke Ingels and his colleagues, they thought, why not make the museums, the whole museum where the installation was supposed to be, and keep the dry dock as a public space in the center of the museum. And that was basically how they won the competition. And it's important for us to have this public space, but it's also important because it creates a whole museum and not just an exhibition space. Because under Danish regulations, you cannot have office spaces if you just have lighting from above. You will need to have proper windows to house office staff. And so they did that. This is a plan of our museum. And as you can see, everything is a bit skewed. There's a lot of straight lines, but they are not parallel. So we have a lot of issues with wayfinding. I'll get back to that. And this is how the dry dock looks now in nighttime. And this time of year, it's basically nighttime all the time. As you see, this bridge in the front with a wooden floor is empty in this picture because it's kind of an old picture. Now it's very much not empty anymore. But you see that we do have glass windows inside the wall of the dry dock. And this particular window, that's our lunchroom, so we can look out. The guests or the children playing in this area can look at us having our lunch, and that's okay. It's nice to see that there's actual visitors, guests, participants in our museum, that we are not secluded from them by more than a glass wall. Yeah, just gonna show you another picture of the, this is taken in the center of the dry dock. As you see, the architects, they've chosen to preserve the quite harsh industrial surroundings to, and not, we don't have any garden solution. We just have this concrete flooring. And if you wonder, these pegs you see in the flooring, they're not an original part of the dry dock. That's our anchors keeping our museum firmly in the ground, because a dry dock is a bit like a bathtub. If you empty it and try to press it into the ocean, then it will slowly pop up because the moisture in the soil. So we need to tie our museum down with more than 400 anchors, reaching more than 40 meters down. So they're basically very, very long screws tying our museum to a layer of chalk beneath the town. Yeah, as you see, this is our very orderly office. It's not that orderly anymore, partly because of my desk. And I'm going to talk a bit about the use of the architecture. As you see, it's important for me, of course, being a staff member, in daily contact. I have guided tours, not every day, but I do guided tours every week at least. So it's important for me to be close to our audience, and it's and also to be close to our exhibitions, because exhibitions, they tend to wear down much quicker than you think. So text will fall down, lighting will go off, things will wear and tear quite heavily, even though we're a museum and people are not really supposed to touch, but they do anyway. That's part of the use. Another part of the use, of course, is for tourists, especially the tourists coming for the exhibition, the architecture itself, and not for the maritime heritage, and not for our collections. As a collection, partly a collection manager as well, of course, I hope that they love our collections when they leave, but I know for certain that a lot of people, they don't love it, or they don't even know it before they enter. And that's how it should be, because if we only cater to the people who love maritime heritage already, then we do not fulfill our purpose. But we try to keep spaces for the people who are not interested in maritime history, but people who are coming for the architecture, to make the maritime history, to give maritime history some breaks, to make it the experience breathable for those who are interested in modern Scandinavian international architecture. And our cafe is an example of that. We don't have any paintings of ships on the walls. We don't have any compasses. We don't have any old maps or reproductions. We keep it as a architectural space, and the only maritime heritage in this space is the old concrete walls from the dry dock itself. And that's very important for us, to have these spaces where people who absolutely hate our exhibition, I hope it's not that many, but I know for certain that a few people, they do, to have a space for them. And also a cafe is extremely important for all those people who love our museum and people who return time and again, because they spend a lot of time in our galleries, and they as well need time to have a cup of coffee, sit down, clear their mind, talk to their family or friends, and then move on to the next gallery. So you cannot overestimate the importance of the cafe and the cafe space in a museum. That's my experience as well. And even though I love museums, I also love finishing a gallery and going to the cafe. I think that goes for a lot of people. There's a lot of architectural details in our building, and now I return to this wayfinding and the safety thing. Is our building is basically a spiraling around the dry dock. So we just have one floor, but that one floor is sloping, and then there's bridges crossing the different levels of that one floor, meaning it can be incredibly hard for people to find their way around, even though we find the building simple. And when I get new colleagues, it takes weeks or months, even months, for them to find their way around the museum, even though the layout is kind of simple. And the most angry visitors I've ever had, that has been people who've been unable to find their way out of the museum. Almost people on the brink of panic because they cannot find their way out. It's like it's a human basic instinct to panic when you can't find your way out. But a lot of these challenges, they also stem from a lot of the beauty we have in our exhibition. And this picture is a staircase. We have a large staircase in the end of marking the end of the museum exhibition for most visitors. And as you see, it's part art and part practicality. So the stairs, they're not the same height all the way through, making it quite challenging for elderly people to use the stairs. So we're really trying to help them with handrails and other things. And this staircase, that's a mark of big, and people take photos of it because they want to share the big story on Instagram. And this next picture is probably our most popular place on Instagram, because that's the Arne Jacobsen chairs. And Arne Jacobsen is of course, a famous Danish modernist architect and designer, and he designed these chairs. So we use them, and they sort of combine or connect our modern architecture to mid 20th century architecture, Danish design, Scandinavian design, which is quite popular among a lot of our international visitors and also our Danish visitors, because my parents, they have these chairs at home as well. So a lot of people, they have them. But, oh yeah, sorry, this is our store, this is our shop. And well, I said you cannot overestimate the role of the cafe. You probably can't overestimate the role of the shop as well. The shop is a place where a lot of those people who don't necessarily like ships, they realize in our shop, hopefully, that, hey, maritime history, it can be something for me as well, because I'm a child, I love Legos, or I'm a person who loves fashion. Hey, they sell fashion as well. I love a good cup of tea. Hey, there's a good cup of tea in a nice handmade mug, and the tea is from India or China, and that connects to the history, the maritime heritage, the maritime history as well. So our shop is a kind of like an exhibition inside the exhibition, a museum inside the museum, and that's very important for us to communicate our themes and our values in our shop. We worked a lot with that. This didn't happen overnight. When we opened, the shop was very different, but it's getting better and better and better, reflecting our core values and themes even better. And we always, in our marketing, always try to connect our products with the building, as you see, because we know that the building is a brand, and we know that people see our building and our museum as a place with great integrity and innovation, and we try to connect our products to that, even though some of the products are quite old-fashioned, like the shirts of these English dogs. But of course, our museum is not just about selling things and catering to the people who like architecture but not maritime history. Our museum is very much about people like her, the visitor. This young woman is her role in this picture is quite different from the role we normally encourage in the exhibitions, because she's looking at a small screen and she's isolated in her own soundscape. And that's something we do now and then, but it's not, and that's very important for me to stress, it's not what we normally do. Normally, our museum is a bit more like this, where we try to make people speak with each other, and especially different people of different generations speaking to each other. So almost all our workshops, they combine elderly people, sailors, seafarers with children, to not just to create a interesting experience for the children, but also to respect and to use the knowledge and the experience of elderly people. And this also ties up to our connectivity to the local community. That's important, because we're not a local. Our themes aren't local. Our themes aren't even national, even though we're the National Maritime Museum of Denmark. All, or at least the vast majority of maritime museums, they are by nature international, and that's a role that we embrace. We're not outright political, but we're trying to work against these nationalist agendas that you can find in a lot of politics in Denmark, and almost always everywhere in the world. That we show that the maritime sector, the maritime business, has forever, since its very birth, been international in its core. So we want to be a space for people to interact with each other, but we also want to be a place of wonder for the individual. And this is our room, our entry into the museum. And it's important for me to say that our exhibitions, initial exhibitions, they were made with the aid of Cosman de Jong, an exhibition designing company of in Netherlands, in Amsterdam, and we chose them to work with the building of BIC. And that was quite interesting because Cosman de Jong and BIC, they have very different ideas of aesthetics. Where BIC, they have interesting buildings, they still have this kind of minimalist approach to materials and surfaces. Cosman de Jong, they were the other way around. They wanted storytelling absolutely everywhere. So it was important for us to have this contrast between the exhibition and the building. But it's also very important not to fight the building, but to play along with the building. And you can, I think Cosman de Jong managed to do that quite well in merging their aesthetics with the BIC aesthetics, even though they were quite different. But it's not always easy. And another thing that's important for me as a storyteller in a building is that you need to be quite brave at curating, to have spaces where you have absolutely no artifacts. So this is an actual museum exhibition in our museum. It has changed very much right now as we speak. I'll show you that later. But this is an actual space. And here we communicate life on board the ship as a contrast to this vastness that is the ocean. That life on board the ship is concentrated and only a few people understand it, and that's the sailors. From outsiders, it can be difficult to grasp. So you have to peek in and you have to walk in to experience it yourself. And that led to quite a lot of people saying, would you waste so much space? Why don't you exhibit more? And we said that our aim isn't to exhibit more. Our aim is to communicate the world as we see it and communicate those parts of the story that we find the most interesting, and to create spaces that are changing, so you won't experience too much of this museum fatigue that we all know from even the most beautiful and exciting museums, if they're just too big and too much of the same kind of storytelling, the same kind of rooms. So this space, now it looks like this. And that brings me to another point, that we try to reuse our spaces, and we need to create versatile spaces, because we are born with this building, and we were born with an exhibition in that building, but we need to create new exhibitions all the time. So we need very much to reuse the spaces and to change the spaces totally. Even though the spaces, they physically remain almost the same, we put a lot of different things inside them and create different atmospheres. And another important thing is here that we play a lot with light, daylight or no daylight, to create these films, because of course we couldn't do this kind of projection in an area with daylight. So another thing I couldn't find the slide, unfortunately. I tried to find it, but it was hidden somewhere on our server, where BIC, they made a plan where you could see the amount of daylight in different parts of the exhibition, and that's very important for the making of the exhibitions. So this is the exhibitions we have now: Oceanista, Fashion, and the Sea. This used to be our exhibition on navigational history, one of my personal babies, but you have to kill your darlings sometimes to make room for new darlings, and this is one of them. Unfortunately, it's closing next week, so you have to hurry if you want to travel from Brazil to see it. Another point is that we try to reuse quite a lot of our materials, the showcases, the shelves, the lighting, the projectors, of course, to save our own economy during a pandemic especially, but also to protect the environment. And it's easier said than done. I know that. I think everyone know, working with scenography and exhibitions, they know it's easier said than done. So this is a space where we I showed you the empty bridge, and this was how it looked before. We didn't really know to use this bridge, this area, because it's quite narrow. It's sloping quite steeply, so elderly people, they can't really walk there. A lot of people are afraid to do so. Even when it opened, they had untreated wooden floors. That was beautiful for a month. And then winter arrived and people were dragging their wet shoes with snow and slush and gravel and dirt into the museum. And within half a year, these untreated wooden floors, they couldn't be used anymore. And we had to varnish them at our own dear expense, unfortunately. So I'm just saying this to say that we absolutely love our building and the vision of the building, but there's a lot of small practical things where the everyday use suffered because of architects that weren't that too interested in materials and surfaces or didn't know a lot about it. Architects to be harsh on them. I don't want to be too harsh because I like them and I think they're brilliant, but they were really occupied with how it looked on the opening day and maybe less occupied with how it looked a year later. And this space looks totally different now. Now it looks like this. So this is the same bridge and the same kind of audience, the children. So in this area where it's extremely hard to make a old-fashioned museum exhibition because there's lots and lots of daylight, and obviously a lot of our artifacts, they cannot endure daylight. You cannot exhibit them there. Then we chose to create our space for children there, where they're free to run and yell and roam around and jump and touch absolutely everything. And this area is also important because this is one of our windows to the world. So this is where people standing outside the museum, they look into the museum. And frankly, it was a bit sad the first couple of years. We thought we had this wonderful exhibition, this wonderful museum, and then people just saw more or less empty bridges with very old-fashioned exhibitions. So it's extremely important for us that our exhibition, our museum looks alluring from the outside, and I really think that we succeeded with this. I can praise this lavishly because I didn't make it myself, so this was my wonderful colleagues making this space for children. So now I'm talking a lot about our new museum, but we also chose to preserve something from the old museum, notably ship models. We have a lot of people, notably elderly men or senior citizens who love their ship models. I do as well, but I can't make the museum just as I. So I just want to see a lot of ship models, but we do want to showcase ship models, and this is literally showcasing ship models here, with sailing in the same direction through a classic museum space with a different example of goods underneath them. And I bring this example up because you don't have to change absolutely everything to create a wonderful experience for visitors of the 2020s. You can take something from the 1940s and make it count as well. This is a gallery in our old exhibition at Kronborg Castle, where made just after World War II in 1946, I believe, where they recreated the exhibition after the war. And this exhibition looked more or less like this for half a century till we closed in 2012. Most people, they ran through this exhibition very quickly, and it wasn't that interesting to a lot of our visitors. But for the people who like, and I'm now going back, who like this, they also like this. And we try to recreate, one of our upcoming projects is trying to recreate a wonderful Wunderkammer, a wonderful space of ship models for those visitors who love them. But ship models and artifacts, even though I love my maritime artifacts, they do not communicate maritime life and life experiences by themselves. That's also why I was talking about this daylight, not daylight situation inside the building. And one of the reasons that that's very important for us is because we want to bring photos and films alive in the exhibition, making use of our vast photo archive, to show that the connection between people of the past, people of the present, and the artifacts themselves to show which kind of universe do these artifacts belong in, and which kind of world do these people whose stories we're telling, which kind of life did they actually experience themselves, their smells, the sounds they were hearing, the feelings they had, the danger, the love, the fear, the fate, all those strong human emotions. They are very important for us. So we're not that much an exhibition for ships anymore. We're very much an exhibition about a museum about goods and feeling. I told you, and now I'm almost finished, that we were in a port area, and this is a picture of the port. As you see, it's a small provincial port in Denmark, and the story behind this port is that it wasn't built to harbor small ships. It was built to create space for the shipyard industry. But now we're working with the local authorities, the local council, to create better spaces for wooden ships, to create a maritime atmosphere outside the museum as well. And that's something that we notice is very important to a lot of these Danish visitors, at least, that we have the sailing wooden heritage as part of our museum. There tend to be a bit of a culture clash between professional maritime historians as me, and then the sailors, the people who are sailing the old wooden vessels, who are still doing it, who have this passion for that. So we're really trying to accommodate them as well, and to create spaces, not necessarily within our museum, but within the port, to have this very hands-on, very beautiful, atmospheric part of the maritime history as well. And that was it for me. I'm gonna thank you, and if you have any more questions about how we try to combine modern architecture in an old frame with modern storytelling about old things to young and old people, then I'm obviously very happy to answer any questions, and about now or later or by mail or whatever. Thank you for having me.
Torbjorn, Mr. Torbjorn, at the end of the last lecture, we shall begin again with questions. There are several topics. It's very interesting to see how the curatorship positioned itself and positions and interacts in the perspective of an architecture that gains protagonism, which is a characteristic of museum architectures nowadays. And so therefore we have many questions to ask. Very interesting what you have said. We will ask the questions at the end following the last lecture. I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Michelangelo Campadonico, has been ever 2005 a director of UMA Institute, Maritime Museums at Geneva, including the Museo del Mare. Currently works in a project of the National Immigration Museum in Italy that is also in Geneva, an initiative of the Foreign Relations Ministry and the Culture Ministry in the Geneva city. Mr. Capodonic will address interactiveness and inclusion. He speaks Portuguese, and therefore the Portuguese will be delivered in Portuguese, which we thank him very much. Mr. Campadonico, the floor is yours. Good morning, Evandro. Can you hear me? Can you folks hear me?
Pequeno problema de conexão.
I think we have a connection problem. We will soon reconnect. Can you now hear me? Yes, sir, we can hear you loud and clear. What I bring to you are my greetings. Italy, a country that has very strong bonds with Brazil, bonds that go beyond 1.5 million immigrants, Italian immigrants that have settled in several corners of Brazil, among which as well my parents also, they came back to Italy nevertheless. However, that is why I speak a bit of Portuguese, and I apologize for my accent. I will begin with a clarification. Museums in the past 20 or 10 years have changed quite significantly, and they still are changing. This was the definition given by ICOM in 1986. A museum is a non-profit permanent institution in the service of society and its development, open to the public, which acquires, conserves, researches, communicates, and exhibits the tangible and intangible heritage of humanity and its environment for the purposes and exposes them for study, education, and enjoyment. As you are well aware, by 2019, a new definition began to be drafted. It has not as yet been accepted in full by all, but the meaning is quite clear. Museums are democratizing spaces, inclusive spaces, and polyphonic spaces for a critical dialogue about the past and the future. By recognizing and addressing the conflicts and challenges in the present, they hold artifacts and specimens in custody for society and to safeguard diverse memories for future generations and to guarantee equal rights and equal access to the heritage for all people. We now, therefore, go from a museum as a place for collections and material testimony to a museum that is a place where the community thinks, reflects about its history, its culture, its identity, and its problems. What consequence does this bring about for museums? Well, it means that the museum, with regard to the past, must have a particular care towards visitors. We might add, in other words, that nowadays it is no longer possible to think in a museum without thinking in the visitor as a fundamental subject for the construction of a museum. Nevertheless, we need the access, and from these premises between museum and visitor arises the bipillar of interactivity and inclusion. What does this mean for a museum to be interactive? We might say that a museum is not a book to be read. Quite the contrary, a museum, a contemporary museum, addresses all of our senses, sight, of course, but also touch, because a museum must be touched. Listening, because a museum is a place where we must listen to certain things, and if we want, also a place for smelling, if we so wish. Think about an exhibit that shows medieval species like pepper, ginger, cinnamon, and makes them understand about smelling. A museum, maybe, why not? A place for appreciating the taste of food. In Italy, of course, this is quite appreciated. When we have a restaurant and a museum, it's because there is a cultural connection with the exhibit, presenting typical dishes of a community, such as seafood for a sea or a maritime museum. About 20 years ago, when computers began to be used intensively, many thought that the future of museums would be virtual, digital. to be watched, visited from the computer at the comfort from our home. But that's not what happened. Museums, virtual museums, never became, in fact, important, although we have had expedited a retrocess, an alternative, when years ago in 2020, at the moment, at the most difficult moment of the pandemic, the COVID pandemic in Europe, in America, in Asia, everybody was locked up at home due to lockdown, and a virtual museum, the digital museum, was the only way for folks to appreciate the contents in the museums. We might add, a virtual museum is cold. A physical museum, on the other hand, can be empathic. Empathy for a museum is a very important feature. It translates into the capacity to awaken emotions within the public. Let me give you an example. The Maritime has an Italian submarine, an exhibit. And this is very similar to Maria, where you have another submarine. We, as managers and curators of these museums, did not want only to introduce or present a restored vessels with its tools and utensils. We wanted rather to reconstruct an atmosphere, a world, to put within the vessel the mannerisms, the material day-to-day of that time, but also the voices of the crew, the noises of the engines. And this allowed us to reconstruct a world whose objectives we had to transport our visitors to a time that was, but no longer is, the world of the Cold War, of the global conflict between the West and the Russia of the Varsovia Pact. The museum became, therefore, literally a time machine. Therefore, a museum becomes more than anything an experience. To this experience, we might add that it is immersive, and the visitors is immersed in a world that is not his. It is another time. Gaining experience using interactivity is what Anglo-Saxons call edutainment, education plus entertainment. Interactivity. How should interactivity be implemented? It should be quick because visitors don't have time. I'm not able to learn a booklet to explain me the instructions for a game. I need something intuitive. I must understand while I play, because visitors must be able to see how his intervention transforms things, creates an action, a solid, a tangible action, because interactiveness is delicate, it's fragile. They don't last much like the museum would do, because it's a museum that's circulated by and used by many people, and it's curious to see. It should satisfy visitors. If it's boring, it's useless. It should have a message, because games don't have to be an end in themselves. They have to teach something to somebody, something that the visitor doesn't know. Only if interactivity has these features will we be able to say or talk about inclusion. And inclusion is the second topic of our thoughts. In this aspect, we must depart from a premise. To be inclusive, a museum must, before anything, be accessible. In the past years, museums were not accessible. We need to be mindful of this aspect. Museums were for the few. Inaccessible museums are museums that have barriers, and these barriers sometimes are physical. And so therefore, an individual in a wheelchair or has some discapacity or is an elder is unable to join in, to go into the museum. Many a times, these barriers are mental, cultural. Let's think of a history of a major museum like the Louvre. It arose as a collection of the crown of France, but following the revolution in France, it is stated the artistic heritage and historical heritage does not belong to the sovereign, but rather it is property of the state. It is a collection of assets for all. This is a revolutionary principle that allows us to go from a private collection to a public collection, to a museum. But it is not enough to affirm the principle that a museum belongs to everyone. It is not enough to open the doors and say, come and join us. Most people will not come because they will tell you that they are not interested in this. But likewise, several will not come because they lack the tools, the cultural tools, to understand what is being exhibited. This is the major problem for contemporary museums. To create a museum that is physical and culturally accessible to all,
são, na verdade, muitos visitantes diferentes. O público é dividido em muitos grupos. Quem são eles? As crianças, os estudantes, os jovens, as famílias, os adultos, os idosos, os deficientes e as minorias étnicas, linguísticas, LGBT, etc. Cada desses públicos tem uma abordagem diferente do museu, fortemente condicionada para suas necessidades. As crianças, por exemplo, precisam de uma mensagem simples e compreensível. Para aqueles que não sabem ler ou aprenderam recentemente, serão necessárias outras maneiras de entender. Portanto, uma mediação educacional é fundamental. Os idosos têm necessidades diferentes. Um museu acessível aos idosos é um museu com muitos lugares para sentar, porque eles se cansam. Está equipado com várias casas de banho, de fácil acesso, mas não chega. As legendas não precisam ser pequenas porque talvez haja problema de visão. Um ótimo capítulo é sobre pessoas com deficiências. Frequentemente consideramos para esta categoria as pessoas incapazes de se moverem independentemente e, portanto, forçadas a se mover em uma cadeira de roda. Mas não é só isso. As pessoas com deficiências podem ter outras deficiências físicas, como ser cega. Nesse sentido, o uso de documentários em áudio ou a criação do elemento tridimensional a serem tocados e reconhecidos podem ser importantes na relação do visitante cego com o acervo. Agora você vê dos quadros mais importantes da nossa coleção, o retrato de Cristóforo Colombo. E nós fazemos recentemente uma cópia em 3D desse retrato para as pessoas cegas. Portanto, vamos voltar ao conceito anterior. Um museu contemporâneo deve ser acessível e, para ser acessível, deve ser multissensorial. A mensagem do museu devem ser capazes de viajar em diferentes sentidos, da visão ao tato, da audição ao olfato. Mas também podemos ter o caso das deficiências cognitivas. E neste caso, a reflexão deve incidir sobre o trabalho tanto dos curadores, que são aqueles que formulam a mensagem do museu, como dos mediadores culturais, que encontram as formas e instrumentos para veicular essa mensagem. A última questão é muito importante e também muito problemática. A relação entre o museu e as minorias emergiu de forma muito forte nos últimos 2 anos. Os movimentos Black Lives Matter têm destacado nos Estados Unidos como uma certa história consolidada e codificada não era mais acessível. Muitas vezes sabemos a história foi escrita para aqueles que venceram. É o caso da colonização no Novo Mundo, e os indígenas perdidos foram retratados de certa forma como selvagens e ignorantes, resumindo, homens primitivos. Hoje, essa leitura é considerada ofensiva para a população que tivera e tem sua própria cultura e civilização, bem como uma relação com seu meio ambiente. Ser um museu inclusivo significa, portanto, poder reler a história a partir de diferentes pontos de vista, até do lado dos que perderam as batalhas da civilização. Este é um grande desafio. E esse desafio foi já instruído no 1986, nas participações dos grupos étnicos nas atividades do museu. Esse é um ensinamento que tem mais de 40 anos, mas está bem longe que for aplicado no museu. Somente se o museu contemporâneo vai conseguir sair da gaiola da história oficial e ser aventurado no terreno das histórias plurais, poderá se tornar um museu comunitário e estar à altura dos desafios culturais do terceiro milênio. Muito obrigado pela vossa atenção. Fico em espera das vossas perguntas e me desculpo assim para o meu feio português. Obrigado.
Bad Portuguese. I'm sorry.
A palestra foi ótima e o seu português é excelente.
It was a great presentation and your Portuguese is excellent. Do not apologize for it because it was absolutely wonderful. Correct.
Da seguinte maneira,
I am going to proceed
fazer uma
as follows.
específica para
I would like to ask a specific question to each speaker,
tempo uma
and at the same time,
para cada deles.
I would like to ask a general question for each one of them. So I'm going to be asking 2 questions to each speaker,
E a ordem
and I will be following the order of the presentations. And I will start
com a senhora Gail Simonton.
from, I'll start with Ms. Gail Simonton.
O seguinte,
Gail, so I'd like to ask you the following question.
nós sabemos que a história da navegação,
We know the history of navigation.
vou fazer duas.
The first question, I'm actually going to ask you 2 questions, right?
Sabemos que a história da navegação ela
So we know the history of navigation has strict connections with the colonial process.
da navegação ocidental
The history of Western navigation concerning the colonial process, which developed in the past few centuries. Since the Maritime Museum, or given the perspectives of a maritime museum, how should this museum, what stance should this museum take in terms of this perspective of a colonial museum? That's the first question I'd like to ask. And the second question I'm going to be repeating to all of you. What is the position of maritime museums in face of the climate crisis that is hitting our world today? So, Ms. Simonton, you have the floor. We cannot hear. We cannot hear Ms. Simonton.
How about now? Is that better? Can you hear me now? Yes, great.
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Sorry, the sound is not very good on the headphones. How do we tackle the issue around colonialism? Well, obviously, here in the UK, we are tackling that on a daily basis, and I suppose what we're trying to do is not. Is not to tell only one side of that story, and to be much more open, to listen and to connect with others. So we have internal expertise in the museum, but what we're trying to do is to connect with people who have lived experience of the legacies of empire, of colonialism across the globe, but also those in particular who are still living in the UK. So we have many communities in London and across the UK who we are connecting with to create programs with and to create programs for. And in order to have those discussions and to be more open about those discussions, we're doing that in collaboration with multiple communities so that we can understand the various stories, the various experiences of people, and how empire and how colonialism has affected different countries, different communities, different geographical places, but also what that now in turn does, and particularly in the UK for racism, for example, in the UK, and really experiencing and understanding what those histories have left us in terms of legacies going forward. So, for example, we have a gallery which deals with trade and deals with the Atlantic and the trade across the Atlantic, and that was created in 2014, I believe. And we are reassessing that gallery with various communities to ask them how we should treat certain subject areas and certain subject matters. So I think what is important is that we don't assume that we are the experts and that we have all the knowledge, because not only are our collections usually biased towards a very colonial collection, if you like, but the way we've told the stories in the past has also been reflected in those galleries and in those collections. So what we must do is continue to collect to fill the gaps in those collections, and therefore be able to exhibit, and therefore be able to tell a broader range of stories and a broader range of experiences of how navigation and how the creation of empire across the world has had an effect everywhere, and also in the UK itself. So I guess that hopefully tackles the first question. And the second one, I think what we're finding with the climate crisis is it has got to a stage where we cannot simply make an exhibition about it. And we cannot simply make an exhibition that encourages people to recycle, to reuse, to lobby their local government. The climate crisis, as many people have said in this conference so far, as we are international museums, as the oceans connect all of us into one group of people or peoples, it's something that we must tackle in everything that we do. So here in Greenwich, we are looking at everything in terms of how we operate and how we work, and all the appropriate ways to run a business or an organization in this modern day, and how we should reuse, recycle, etc., and have more sustainable ways of producing exhibitions, I think, as was mentioned in one of the previous talks. But I think really our mission is to be a platform for that discussion. So, for example, a very simple thing we're doing at the moment, we have an art exhibition about Canaletto in Venice, which is very much around the arts scene and how that fits with the Queen's House. But of course, Venice is under pressure from mass tourism and rising sea levels. So we cannot have an exhibition about the arts of Canaletto in Venice without having this discussion. Most recently, we had a visit from the RRS, Sir David Attenborough, the British Polar Research Ship. And rather than having an exhibition about this, we have a festival. We had a whole festival around this where we invited scientists, we invited experts to come into our museum and to talk to the public about what they are doing. So once again, a bit like the previous question, is to accept that we are not the experts in this area, and we never will be, and we must be a platform to invite people into our organisation, into our spaces, into those public spaces that we talked about in a previous discussion, to allow people to see what they think and to make up their own minds and understanding of the crisis that's going on at the moment. So I think museums have a responsibility to be that platform, to be honest about the situation that we're in, not necessarily to be activists, but to be a reflection of what is going on in society, rather than a microcosm of our own little world.
Muito obrigado. Vou passar a fazer
Thank you
duas
very much. I will now ask two questions to Torbjorn. It's very important for us now, when we are currently constructing a museum. An international competition was proposed. There was a group of winners, and we are now developing discussions around this project that was the winner of this competition. So I'd like to know, first of all, how in a museum with such a protagonist kind of architecture, we would like to know how did you engage with the curators? How did curators engage with the architects in order to pose to them the needs, the perspectives, the curatorial ideas, in order to have an architectural design that would not overcome the curatorial projects? Because we see that such a protagonist, such a mainstreaming architecture as that, could perhaps become even more important than the curatorial process. And this is impossible. It should not happen, obviously. So the first question is, how was that process like? And how do you think this process should be in modern museums, this process between curatorship and architecture? And the second one is the same question. How does your museum position itself in terms of the climate crisis?
Yes, thank you. To start with this curatorship inside a new building, which is I worked with that, so it was a part of my work life for 3 years, that we were building, they were constructing the building at the same time as we were designing the exhibition and the content of the exhibition. Generally, I don't think it was a big problem. Remember that we came from the old castle, where there was also a lot of challenges building-wise, that there was no accessibility for wheelchairs, for instance, only spiral staircases, almost no toilets, almost very sparse lighting, very sparse heating. So just this moving from an old Renaissance castle into a new museum with a lot of modern functionalities, that was already a step forward. That said, as I touched upon in the presentation, there was a lot of challenges with the surfaces being worn out, or being basically just ugly after a very short time, because they weren't really used. They weren't really made for 150,000 people passing them in 1 year. So that I think that's very, very important, not just because of the aesthetics, but also because it's an extra economic burden on the museum to refurbish a new building after 1 or 2 years. We had quite a lot of meetings with the architects in Bjarke Ingels group, where we told them about our desires for practicality more than our desires for storytelling, because we quite quickly realized that with this building we had, combining daylight, non-daylight, narrow spaces, wide spaces, lower spaces and taller spaces, then we had a very versatile building where you could fit a lot of stories into it. So that's also something we try to do, to use the rooms to their best purpose. So we have large themes in larger rooms and more narrow themes in more narrow rooms. So for instance, the history of navigation exhibition that I made, that was one of the larger rooms, obviously because the the ocean is the largest room we have in the world. So and we didn't have anything apart from projections on the wall, because on the oceans there are no walls. So we wanted our visitors to forget about walls and enjoy this experience of being in the middle of the ocean together with our ancestors at sea. And generally, I think that people are quite good at that when I visit museums in new buildings. But we do have issues with practicality, and that especially for our conservators, that we don't have a workshop in the museum. We wanted that so they could work hands-on with restoring the old artifacts in the museum, but we don't have that because that kind of room wasn't prioritized, and that was something that we dearly wanted, but now we have it in another building in another part of town. Another thing was that we have a difficult time exhibiting large objects because we can't get them into the building. So when I went to the Riverside Museum in Glasgow a few years back, and it's a wonderful museum, lots of wonderful artifacts, especially cars and trains and things like that. I just marveled at this huge gate they had where they could drive in whole trains into the museum. And I was just feeling so jealous that they could get trains into the museum and we can't even get parts of ships into the museum because of how our building is. Well, that's a kind of a compromise, because we also know that a lot of our visitors, they come because of the architecture, and they wouldn't come if we just had a practical square storage facility. So that's also a compromise, yeah. And I'm going to proceed to the next question regarding the climate crisis. It's something that we deal with it. We didn't deal a lot with it, to be honest, when we made our museum 8 years ago. But the knowledge and the understanding about the climate crisis has also changed and is much larger now than it was 8 years ago. So we try to keep a focus on our own energy consumption. Personally, I don't fly anywhere. So when I visit the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich last month, actually, I took the train. I urge my colleagues to do the same, but they have small kids, so it's a bit more difficult for them to get the whole their daily life to cater into that. But of course, if more generally speaking about our institution, that we are a museum in a hole right next to the sea, so it would be weird for us not to deal with the climate crisis. But to be honest, we haven't found a way how to deal with it just yet. It ties into different things that present day history or present day is often the hardest thing to communicate in a museum. And then the climate crisis, which kind of our collection doesn't reflect the climate crisis at all, because the old artifacts are not connected to the climate, the vast majority of them. But I would like to say, I think that in our archives, we do have materials that can not just help communicate climate crisis and climate history, but also progress or help climate climate science. I was just 2 days ago, I was at the National Archives in Denmark, and they're working with the National Weather Institute to look out for weather descriptions, climate descriptions in old ship's journals. And we have a lot of old ship's journals where sailors, they were noting the weather conditions day after day after day for years and years and years. And not only noting the weather conditions, but also exactly where they were at the time. So they're actually one of the most rich climate records we have. And we have a tiny bit of them in our museum, and the National Archives in Copenhagen, they have lots. And on a worldwide basis, I imagine it's a huge data set that can be used actively to make scientists better at understanding climate of the past and thus predicting the climate of the future. Thank you.
fazer uma pergunta para o
I'd like to ask a question to Mr. Priangelo. We know that we are currently working on part of a museum geared towards immigration. As you have said at the beginning of your talk, there has been a long history about immigration between Italy and Brazil. What can you tell us as to this immigration process, particularly with regard to maritime transportation that occurred in this immigration process from Italy to Brazil at the beginning of the past century? And the second question is the same as to the climate crisis. Thank you, Evandro. Well, I would like, if at all possible, to intervene in response to the first question that was addressed to our colleague in Denmark. Because as the architect and the curators of a museum, this is essential. It is a very, very critical point of our day-to-day activities and the works, and the result of a museum depends of this relationship. Furthermore, we have two types of experience. The first one was done with the Galata Museum of the Sea, and from there we provided too much freedom to the architect, and so therefore the proposal of the architect was done and addressed to the curators. From that arose a dialectic that was somewhat similar to a struggle or a confrontation between different concepts as to museography. It was a good experience, but it was an experience that was participative. It was difficult for us to reach at the bottom of this. And the second experience was somewhat different. As we had with Galatad, as curators, we conducted a predisposition of the itinerary in terms of exhibition for the Immigration Museum. Something broad with full freedom, but a site where curators had to abide by the principles, the messages to be given by the museum. Later on, it would be easier to dialogue and talk to the architect. The architect joined us more quickly within this dialectic, and the understanding of that which we wanted to do. And that was a good experience. And I wanted to reconcile, if curators need the principles, the exhibits, and the messages, it's better for the job that the architect has to conduct. Second question, the relationship existing between a maritime museum and immigration. In several parts across the globe and other museums, they address the subject matter. But for Italians, this has a major importance because the development of the Italian naval force was a fruit of the development of immigration. And so therefore the two museums walked hand in hand. Even the discourse was similar. Some talk about the journey and the others about the reasons for the departure. And those that had some experiences, they shared these experiences in Argentina and Brazil, in others countries like the United States or elsewhere. So therefore we have two standpoints, two sides of the same coin, if you will. It is a single story having two parts, two different parts, the dialogue among themselves or between themselves. The third question, what is our stance with regard to this? I might say that we are victims still as a museum of the climate crisis. The past 40 days, during 4 occasions, the museum had to close its doors and evacuate the premises, because in beautiful and warm Italy, we had rains, tropical rains, that we call water bombs, that caused or rendered it impossible the museum's activities. And so therefore we realized that this was not something irrelevant or a lie, but rather it is a crisis, it's an emergency at global level, and the whole message of the museum will be geared to this now. And the response lies in sustainability of the museum, and so therefore the possibility of having perhaps some type of electrical power that comes from renewable alternative sources. The struggle against the plastic aspects, if you will. There's a monster that is even greater, coming from the past, that swimming in this sea. This is plastics. This is far more dangerous than other dwellers and sea dwelling monsters, if you will, the plastics monsters. So therefore, to ban plastics from museum and teach new generations that this is important, but this is not something that is educational for the younger. It's for everyone. Why? Because by having thought geared towards sustainability and with the sea is an essential condition for survival in the near future. I would like to, prior to our closing, I would like to ask whether any of you would like to make a comment of what any one of the other lecturers made. Would you have any comments as regards the other colleagues that have commented?
I do. Shall I go ahead? It was around the comment of the architecture versus the curatorial content of a museum. My career started as an exhibition designer and working with architects, and now I obviously work more in the management and the organization of content and the creative side of content. And I suppose what I've learned in my career, from beginning as someone who was designing interactives, to someone who was designing exhibition spaces, to now who's someone who is commissioning those spaces. And in particular, at the moment, we're commissioning for the Royal Observatory, which is a World Heritage Site. So you're commissioning architecture for a site that is both historically precious from an architectural point of view, but it's also precious from a content point of view. But none of those things might be relevant or interesting to the public if we don't commission those in the right way. And I suppose what I would advise is really owning your brief. It's wonderful to have strong architects who have got great reputations that pull people from all over the country or the globe to come and see your museum. But as a client, you must be very clear on what you want to achieve. Now, the architects may come up with a different approach, and that's great, because we shouldn't tell architects or designers how to design, but we should tell them what we want to achieve. And I think if you can make your brief very clear and very short, then you can always go back to that. So when you're having those arguments, those difficult conversations, you can go back to your 3 or 4 principles and say, are we still delivering against those? And if you hold on to those, then you have lots of room for flexibility to change and move with design and architecture and content, but you still achieve what you set out to achieve in the first place.
Can I comment on that as well? There's also the third party, because there's the architects, yes, and the curators, yeah, but there's also the people actually paying for the building, which is and they were the people more or less. If there was a struggle between what the architect wanted and what the curators wanted, then the the trust, owning the building, because that's not our museum, because we couldn't, of course, finance it ourselves. So it's all 100% external funding. So they decided that we need a large, to be concrete, they decided we need 2 conference spaces, a large one and a small one. There was no, we couldn't argue that maybe we just need one, because that was not for us to decide, and it was not for the architects to decide either. It was a demand from the people paying the building. So for us, in our case, it's also the 30 party. And these things, they lead to, and I don't object to that, it was, that's how things they are. That lead to a situation where we're still working with the rooms, trying to reinvent our rooms. And I think it's important not to have this idea that we create a room for this exhibition and this exhibition. It needs to be room for maybe 10, 100 different exhibitions lasting for the next 100 years. So they need to be, while they need to fit the values of the museum, they also need to be versatile. And I think that that's what we've been struggling a bit with, how to use our spaces the best. And I don't think that you can hope to hit the ball out of the park in the first attempt. You will have experiences where this room isn't that fit for what we're doing with it. Maybe we should try to use it for something else, and that process will continue. And I think that's okay.
Algum comentário?
Any other further comments?
Pierangelo?
Pierangelo?
Eu penso que
I think in a process where we want to build a new museum, we must define the roles that the curators and the directors should have. And there should be flexibility with regard to the space, because this is a very important aspect. We must be fearful, or we must rather have the elegance of the architect. And I apologize for saying this, because the elegance or a design of a collection not always is the best thing for the public. The engagement or the involvement of individuals within the public many a times lie in the scenography, in the capacity that this space has to position things in a direct connection with the public. And so therefore the architect who has the elegance might be a danger to adjusting and distributing fairly this balance, and to measure properly what the museum wishes to reconcile between its exhibit and the public. I would like to think that the mission that curators have is to think before anything as to the trajectory, the feelings that will be provided to the visitors, going from the place where they understand things to the place where they have emotions, where they try emotions, where they feel involvement with what they see, with the stories that they hear, with the things that they see in the collection. And so therefore, sometimes one occasion may be different. It might be a beautiful museum, if you will, but sometimes there are beautiful museums that are cold because they are unwelcoming, because they don't receive the visitors warmly, because they don't involve the visitor in the trajectory. So therefore, the story that we wish to retell in museums is the end line, is the best way for us to catch the visitor, to engage the visitor. And that is the goal of a museum. We as curators or as museum directors should not wish to see a beautiful museum, architecturally speaking. A museum has to be that talks to the public. This is slightly different, as perhaps is the reason why I will be in conflict with my colleagues architects. As curators, we may have at least one aspect, one opinion in common, which is the importance, the absolute importance of the direct experience of the public with the works or the universe that is being exhibited in the museum. This experience is absolutely relevant. It is what we seek. It is no middleman experience, if you will, an intense direct experience of individuals that attend to involve themselves with the narrative of the museum. I would like to thank immensely all of you, your generous participation. I would like to invite you all for the grand opening within a few years, hopefully. I hope that you are able to visit Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. It will be a major moment, a significant moment for us, and your cooperation certainly will be remembered, I promise. And I would like, furthermore, that this is not only our first contact. I hope that we have additional further contacts in future to share experiences and opinions. Thank you very much. I now give the floor to Commander Adriana to conduct the wrap up of this meeting. Thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you, Evander. We have now reached the end. I invite you to join us tomorrow, 10 o'clock at the YouTube at the Association Abrigo do Marinheiro to watch the last and final day with the topic collections and exhibits, which that will have Jeroen van der Vliet as a guest, Chief of Collections and Research of the Maritime Museum in Holland, Commodore José Flavinho, Director of the Maritime Museum in Lisbon, Portugal, and Dr. Hannah Hagmag, Executive Director of the Holland Maritime Museum Trust in Mariehamn, Finland. I'll see you tomorrow, and thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. It was great hearing you all.